I stood by the hospital bed, looking down at my sister's pale face as she waited for the words that would save her life. I had the test results right there in my hand, proving I was the exact donor she needed to survive. She reached out, tears of relief welling in her eyes, but I didn't reach back. Hi, I'm Sarah, and this is When Karma Calls. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to bleed you dry, and it takes walking away entirely to realize you owe them nothing. If you've ever had to cut ties for your own peace of mind, leave a like, hit subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. For 6 years, I was married to a man named Michael, and for most of that time, I genuinely believed we had built a solid foundation. We dealt with the standard disagreements that most couples face, navigating the minor frustrations of daily life, but we always managed to communicate and move forward. I trusted him completely, secure in the life we were building together. Everything felt stable until about 8 months ago, when my younger sister, Jessica, moved back to our hometown. Jessica had been living down in Florida since she was 18. We rarely saw her, mostly just brief visits during the holidays that never lasted more than a few days. According to her, she was forced to come back home because her long-term boyfriend had abruptly ended their relationship and moved away, leaving her with absolutely nothing. The story she told us was that she discovered he was secretly seeing men. I only met the guy a handful of times, so I didn't know him well, but the entire narrative felt slightly off to me. He just didn't strike me as someone living a complex double life who would abandon her without a second thought. I actually tried to call him once just to see if he was okay, but the call wouldn't go through. I realized I was blocked, so I decided to mind my own business and let it go. With nowhere else to go, Jessica moved back into our childhood home with our parents, Barbara and Thomas. For the first month, she drifted around aimlessly, complaining about how hard it was to find a job. Wanting to be supportive, I brought up the idea of Michael helping her out. He was a manager at his company and had enough influence to at least get her a foot in the door. He made a few calls, and within a week, Jessica was hired for a position in his department. At the time, I thought I was just doing a nice thing for my sister, even though she and I had never been particularly close. Growing up, Jessica was always the center of my parents' universe. My mother blatantly favored her, and my father simply agreed with whatever my mother wanted to avoid conflict. It wasn't always massive, dramatic gestures of favoritism, but rather a constant, exhausting stream of small inequities. When we turned 16, they bought me a battered, 8-year-old sedan, while Jessica was gifted a nearly brand-new sports car. They spent thousands of dollars on her dance routines, driving across the state for weekend competitions without ever complaining about the cost or the time. But when I asked for a small entry fee for a summer sports clinic at the community college, they acted like I was draining their retirement fund. They eventually paid it, but they made sure I felt guilty about the expense. The disparity in how we were disciplined was even more frustrating. Once, in high school, I lost track of time and came home 15 minutes past my curfew, which resulted in my car keys being confiscated for an entire month. A year later, Jessica stumbled through the front door 2 hours late, smelling heavily of smoke, and she received nothing more than a quiet, disappointed lecture. Because of that dynamic, I was honestly quite relieved when she originally packed up and left for Florida. Despite our history, when she first moved back and started coming over to our house frequently, I tried to view it positively. I thought maybe she was finally growing up and wanting to establish a real relationship with me. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing a shift in how she and Michael interacted. They became incredibly comfortable with each other, falling into long, hushed conversations that would abruptly end when I walked into the room. They developed inside jokes that made no sense to me, and whenever I tried to ask what they were laughing about, they would simply brush it off as office humor. I brought it up to Michael a few times, asking why they were suddenly so close, and he calmly explained that they just had a lot in common and were collaborating heavily on a new project for his department. The first genuine warning sign appeared about a month into her new job. Michael and I worked completely different schedules. He worked a standard early morning shift, while I worked from mid-morning into the early evening. I started coming home from work to find Jessica already lounging in our living room. When I asked why she was there when I wasn't, the answer was always the same vague excuse about needing to finish up some paperwork with Michael. Then something happened that made me start questioning my own grip on reality. I have a very specific habit when I make our bed every morning before I leave for work. I always arrange the pillows so that the open ends of the pillowcases face outward toward the edges of the mattress. It's just a small, unconscious routine I've done for years. One Tuesday, Jessica had been at our house during the afternoon. When I got home, we all ate dinner together, and then she drove back to my parents' house. Later that night, as I walked into the bedroom, I looked at the bed. The pillows were wrong. The open ends of the cases were facing inward, toward the center of the bed. It was a tiny detail, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. I asked Michael if he had taken a nap that afternoon. He looked up, his expression briefly faltering before he smoothed it over and casually said no. I pointed out that the bed had been disturbed. He offered a tight smile and told me I must have just made it in a rush that morning and forgotten. I waited until he was in the shower that night and quietly went through his phone and his laptop. I found absolutely nothing. There were no hidden messages, no deleted emails, no secret apps. But as I sat there in the dark, logic began to taunt me. They worked in the same office all day, and she spent half her evenings at our house. They didn't need to text or leave a digital trail because they were constantly together. I spent the next 2 weeks feeling like I was slowly losing my mind, analyzing every look they exchanged, waiting for a piece of solid proof. That proof arrived during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. The evening was entirely ordinary until I walked out of the kitchen and paused in the hallway. Michael was walking past Jessica in the living room. As he passed, she reached out and lightly caught his arm. He stopped and turned toward her. She leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear, and for just a fraction of a second, they rested their foreheads together. It was a profoundly intimate gesture, the kind of small movement only people who share a deep, private connection make. Michael suddenly stiffened, pulling away as he noticed me standing there. He walked past me without a word. Jessica simply looked over, offered me a sickeningly sweet smile, and went back to organizing the plates. I knew exactly what I had seen. I wasn't stupid, and I could no longer pretend I was misinterpreting the situation. Still, a desperate part of me didn't want to accept that my husband and my sister were capable of doing this to me. I had loved Michael for nearly my entire adult life. A few weeks prior, I had booked a weekend trip for us to visit a neighboring city, hoping to reconnect. I decided to wait until we were away from all the noise and distractions of home to confront him, praying that there was some massive misunderstanding I just couldn't see. We drove up on a Friday. We had dinner, went out for a few drinks, and spent the night acting like a normal, happy couple. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. The next morning, as we were getting dressed to head out for the day, the weight of it all finally suffocated me. I couldn't pretend for another minute. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, looked at him, and calmly asked if he was sleeping with my sister. I expected denial. I expected anger or deflection. Instead, he just stopped moving. His shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with tears, and he quietly admitted that he was. The air left my lungs. I asked him why, and he gave me a string of pathetic, hollow excuses. He said it was an accident, that they just connected on a deep level, and that a conversation turned into a kiss before he could stop it. I stared at him, feeling entirely numb, and asked if she had been in our bed on the days I was at work. He didn't answer. He just looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything. I simply picked up my purse, walked out of the hotel room, got into my car, and drove the 3 hours back home in complete silence. He had to arrange his own transportation and arrived later that afternoon. He tried to corner me in the kitchen to apologize, crying and begging for a chance to explain, but I didn't say a single word to him. I just packed a suitcase and pointed to the door. He left and checked into a nearby motel. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house to tell them my marriage was over. When I walked in and delivered the news, neither of them looked surprised. They offered a stiff, uncomfortable apology, letting slip that Jessica had packed a bag the night before and told them she wouldn't be home for a few days. I knew immediately she had gone straight to Michael's motel. The divorce proceeded quickly, mostly because I refused to engage in any prolonged negotiations. I wanted him excised from my life as fast as legally possible. Michael rented an apartment, and Jessica moved in with him immediately. At first, Michael told my attorney I could keep the house and the majority of our shared savings. likely motivated by a temporary wave of guilt. But less than a week later, his tone shifted entirely, and he demanded we sell the house and split everything evenly. I knew without a doubt that Jessica was the one dictating his choices from behind the scenes. I didn't care enough to fight them on it. I signed the paperwork, took my half, and watched nearly a decade of my life evaporate. Jessica made sure the transition was as painful as possible. A few days after I caught them, she deliberately tagged me in a photo on social media. It was a picture of her and Michael standing in a park, with him kissing the side of her head. She had captioned it about how grateful she was to finally find true love. It was a calculated, cruel move designed strictly to humiliate me. I deactivated all my accounts immediately. An hour later, my phone vibrated with a text from her. She offered a fake apology for the tag, claimed she hoped we could still be family, and said she was sure I would find my actual soulmate eventually. I blocked her number without replying. If I thought my parents would offer any comfort, I was deeply mistaken. When I told my mother I was permanently cutting contact with both Jessica and Michael, she let out a long, exasperated sigh. She looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance and told me that while the situation was unfortunate, Jessica deserved to be happy just as much as I did. She suggested I was overreacting by cutting them off and insisted that once I found a new man, we could all go back to having family dinners. I felt physically ill. I pulled out my phone and showed her the message Jessica had sent me, along with the photo she had posted. My mother just waved it away, telling me I shouldn't be wasting my time on the internet anyway. I looked over at my father, who was staring blankly at the television. I asked him if he really agreed with how they were treating me. He didn't even make eye contact. He just muttered that he stood by whatever my mother said, got up, and left the room. That was the exact moment I realized I had no family left. I listed the house, finalized the sale, and packed everything I owned. I moved halfway across the country to Minnesota, leaving no forwarding address and telling no one in my family where I was going. The first year in my new state was entirely focused on survival. I started intense therapy to process the profound betrayal of my husband and my sister and the complete abandonment by my parents. Slowly, the heavy fog began to lift. I built a quiet, peaceful routine. During that time, I met a man named David. He was incredibly kind, grounded, and patient. He and his brother, Robert, co-owned a successful local restaurant, and his life was deeply intertwined with a large, loud, incredibly supportive extended family. They welcomed me in without hesitation, offering me the exact kind of warmth and loyalty I had always wanted, but never received from my own blood. About 9 months after I moved, I came home to find an envelope in my mailbox with a familiar return address. One of my distant cousins had apparently figured out where I lived and passed the information along. Inside the envelope was a formal wedding invitation for Michael and Jessica. Tucked inside was a handwritten note from my mother, lecturing me about forgiveness. She wrote that families are supposed to work through their problems and mentioned that Jessica graciously wanted me to be a bridesmaid in her wedding. The absolute delusion of it was staggering. It felt like a physical blow, dragging me back into the chaos I had worked so hard to escape. I threw the invitation in the trash, figured out exactly which relative had leaked my address, and cut them out of my life as well. 4 quiet years passed. David and I got engaged, and we were preparing to move in together. My life felt secure and entirely my own. Then, late one afternoon, I walked out of my apartment building to check the mail and found Michael standing on the sidewalk. He looked older, tired, and deeply uncomfortable. Seeing him standing there in my new city, invading the safe space I had built, sent a spike of cold anger through my chest. Before he could speak, I asked him exactly what he thought he was doing here. He held his hands up defensively and said he just wanted to talk. He told me he and Jessica were getting divorced because he had recently discovered she had been unfaithful to him for nearly their entire marriage. He had the nerve to look at me with sad eyes, saying he didn't expect me to take him back, but that he felt we both needed closure. I looked at this man I used to love and felt absolutely nothing but disgust. I told him in a very calm, even voice that he was never going to get closure from me. I reminded him that he chose to destroy our marriage for a woman who clearly cared about no one but herself, and that his current misery was entirely of his own making. I told him I wanted nothing from him, felt nothing for him, and that I was better off than I had ever been. I turned around, walked back into my building, and locked the door. I immediately informed the property manager, who ensured her maintenance staff, escorted him off the premises with a warning that the police would be called if he returned. I assumed he would give up and go back to wherever he came from, but he was more desperate than I realized. Because my current job had flexible hours, I frequently spent my evenings sitting in a quiet booth at David's restaurant while he managed the dinner rush. I enjoyed being around the staff, many of whom were David's relatives. The next evening, I was sitting at my usual table when the front door opened, and Michael walked straight in. He spotted me, crossed the dining room, and sat down in the chair across from me without being invited. David noticed him immediately. He knew what Michael looked like from old photographs, and he walked over to our table, his posture rigid. Michael actually tried to extend his hand for a handshake. David ignored it entirely, looked down at me, and quietly asked if he needed to physically remove him from the building. Part of me wanted him thrown out instantly, but another part of me felt a cold curiosity. I told David to wait a moment. Michael looked visibly relieved, seemingly interpreting my hesitation as a sign that I still cared. I leaned forward and asked him to explain exactly what happened with Jessica. He eagerly launched into his tragic tale, detailing how he discovered she was carrying on relationships with multiple married men. He tried to frame himself as the resilient victim, mentioning that he had stayed in the marriage for an extra year just to carefully transfer his savings and protect his assets so she wouldn't take half of what he owned. When he finished his story, expecting validation, I just looked at him. I asked where she was living now. He seemed confused by the question but admitted that because she had no money, she had been forced to move back into my parents' house. I nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Then I looked at David and told him I had heard enough and that Michael could be removed now. Michael's expression dropped. He started stammering, insisting we needed to talk about our past. I cut him off, telling him clearly that I didn't care about his apologies or his bank accounts. I only let him speak because I wanted confirmation that my sister had ruined her own life and ended up right back where she started. David stepped forward, gesturing firmly toward the exit. A few of the bartenders and waitstaff had stopped what they were doing and were staring directly at our table. Realizing he was completely outnumbered and entirely unwelcome, Michael stood up, muttered something under his breath, and practically ran out the door. That was the last time I ever saw him. Years moved forward. David and I got married, bought a home, and had 2 beautiful little boys. We opened a second restaurant location with his cousin, and my life was full, busy, and surrounded by people who actually valued me. I had eventually unblocked some of my old social media accounts, feeling secure enough in my new life that I no longer feared my past. But right after my first son was born, a message filtered through from my mother. It was a rambling paragraph offering a weak apology for the past and insisting that she deserved to be part of her grandson's life. The sheer entitlement of it infuriated me. I replied with a single sentence, informing her that I was no longer her daughter, which meant she had no grandchildren, and if she wanted a family, she should focus on the daughter she chose to keep. I blocked the account immediately. She tried creating alternate profiles to bypass the block, but I simply deleted the requests without reading them. The silence lasted for a few more years until, suddenly, my inbox was flooded. It wasn't just my mother this time. My father and even Jessica were sending rapid-fire messages, begging me to contact them. They claimed it was a family emergency and that they desperately needed to speak with me. I ignored it for nearly a month, but the messages grew increasingly frantic. Against my better judgment, I finally agreed to a video call, strictly to find out what was going on so I could tell them to leave me alone. When the call connected, the sight of them surprised me. My parents looked deeply aged and exhausted, and Jessica looked terrible. Her skin was gray, and she appeared frail. They started the call by immediately asking to see my children. I shut that down instantly, telling them they would never see my kids, and demanded to know why they were harassing me. They launched into a rehearsed speech about regret and family bonds, but I cut through the noise and asked for the truth. Finally, the real reason came out. Jessica's kidneys were failing. She had been declining for a couple of years, and her doctors had informed them she needed a transplant to survive. They hadn't reached out because they missed me. They reached out because a sibling was her highest statistical chance for a viable match. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. I asked them to clarify if they had spent months harassing me purely to ask for my organs after everything they had done. My mother immediately became defensive, crying and demanding I stop living in the past. She said Jessica was going to die and accused me of being heartless for holding a grudge when a life was on the line. Then my father spoke up, his voice heavy. He admitted that between Jessica's medical bills and her inability to work, they were drowning financially and were on the verge of losing their house. They needed me to come back to Missouri to get tested for a match, but they also expected me to help them financially. They wanted my kidney, and they wanted my money. Jessica leaned close to the camera, tears streaming down her face, begging me to come home and save her life. She promised that if I wasn't a match, they would never contact me again. I looked at the three of them, feeling an incredible sense of clarity. I told them I needed a day to think about it and ended the call. I talked it over with David that night. He supported whatever decision I made, offering to fly down with me, but I told him I needed to handle this alone. I contacted a medical facility in Minnesota and underwent the preliminary testing privately. I didn't tell my parents I was doing it. I wanted the information securely in my own hands before I made my next move. A week later, the results came back. The medical staff informed me that my tissue and blood markers aligned perfectly with the medical records my parents had forwarded. I was an exact, ideal match. I booked a flight to Missouri the next day. By the time I arrived, Jessica's condition had worsened, and she had been admitted to the hospital. This actually worked in my favor, as it prevented my parents from trying to corner me at their house or force me into a family dinner. I went straight from the airport to the hospital. I didn't notify the medical staff of my results, and I didn't seek out her doctors. I walked directly into Jessica's hospital room. She was lying in the bed, looking small and fragile, hooked up to a series of monitors. My parents were sitting in chairs by the window. When I walked in, all three of them looked up, an expression of desperate hope washing over their faces. I pulled the envelope containing my medical results from my bag and stood at the foot of the bed. I spoke clearly and quietly, ensuring the room was entirely silent before I began. I looked directly at Jessica and told her that I had taken the test in Minnesota. I watched her breath catch as I told her the results showed I was the precise match she needed. I was the exact person who could give her a functioning kidney and save her life. She let out a choked sob of relief and reached her hand out toward me. I didn't move. I kept my voice entirely level and looked her dead in the eyes. I told her that I had traveled all the way here just to look her in the face and tell her no. The silence in the room became suffocating. My mother gasped, standing up from her chair, but I held my hand up to stop her. I told Jessica that she was a deeply selfish, destructive person who had burned down my life without a second thought. I told her that the only reason she was in this position, relying on the sister she betrayed, was because she had alienated everyone else who might have cared about her. I told her I would not be giving her pieces of my body to fix a life she had ruined. My parents started screaming, calling me a monster, begging and demanding that I change my mind. I turned to look at the people who had raised me, the people who had watched my heart break and told me to get over it. I told them to never contact me again. I told them I would not pay their mortgage, I would not pay their medical bills, and I would not attend the funeral. I turned around, walked out of the hospital room, and listened to the sound of my mother's sobbing echo down the hallway. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel conflicted. I walked out into the warm afternoon air, got into a taxi, and headed back to the airport. I flew back to Minnesota, back to a home filled with genuine love, and I never looked back. Thank you for tuning in to When Karma Calls. Healing often means realizing that you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm. If you found strength in this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments how you protect your own peace. Until next time, take care of yourself.